what we need, whether it's vegetables for our dinner, or people for our factories, or brains, right? So we tap them, we use them, with the understanding very often that the only way forward is the concentration of expertise, the concentration of capital. So again, remember, we're talking about a country that has high levels of urbanization, and these levels of urbanization as part of, are part of a global phenomenon of increasing concentration. The most extreme peripheral regions are losing population, and of course the main metropolitan areas, not just in Canada but even elsewhere, are gaining population. What's left for these spaces? Well, they're pleasure peripheries and stress sinks. Short and sweet. These are places that we go to, where we unwind, where we relax, where we take a break, but of course never with the intention of staying. God forbid that we should lose our flight out or our train out. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do there? There's nothing to do, right? This is the mentality. And of course, if you don't have control over the media, this is the current narrative about these places. If you don't control your image, your brand, this is what you are thought of by default. So, what kind of contribution could island studies possibly give to our understanding of rural studies? And this is where my entrepreneurial flair comes in. I'll tell you from the outset, I have no idea where this lecture is going. I'm thinking aloud. I put together a few slides. Hopefully it will make sense to you. I believe very strongly that you may reach conclusions that are not necessarily planned in advance by the speaker. I'm very much a believer in that kind of methodology as an educator. So I'm just throwing out ideas. And then you tell me, I hope at the end, I'm going to leave you lots of time for questions and comments. You tell me at the end whether it was just pure BS or something better. I have to be careful how to speak. So from an island studies point of view, there's quite an interesting build-up now of material that is trying to look at profiling, patterning, different island spaces around the world. Now, of course, this is a very difficult task, and I'm sure you're already saying, how is it possible to compare islands together? Each and every island is different, of course. But at the same time, at a certain level of analysis, for example, from this point of view, we have a historic, an economic history kind of analysis to how these islands got to where they are. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 typologies, 7 profiles that have been proposed by Edward Warrington, who's from Malta, a colleague of mine from Malta, and David Milne, who's Professor Emeritus of Political Science at UPEI, living in Malta, by the way. We switched places. And they've come up with this very interesting typology that is now the basis of further research. So first of all, they remind us, hey, don't forget that some of these backwaters have themselves been centers of empires, right? So this is an important reminder, just to put it in context. Venice, Tonga, Britain, and Japan at different points in time in history have been centers of empires, usually maritime empires. However, the most important, probably the most frequent example of an island governance profile is the island plantation. What's this? This is the island which sells its space, its sun, its climate to others. The typical plantation island would be, of course, an island that sells, say, bananas, right? Or coconuts, or copra, or other types of produce grown from the ground. In a Canadian context, I put Cape Breton because taken from the ground, of course, can also mean coal, can also mean ore, minerals, right? But it also connects with tourism, because tourism has the same kind of effect. It's a place-based economic activity, right? It's geographically specific. You have to go to a certain place, a tourist resort, or a mine, in order to extract, quote unquote, what you need from that space. So that is the plantation model. And as I said, it seems to be a very pervasive, very common stance of islands around the world, not just now, but also in the past, and hopefully also leading into the future. Some other islands have been looked at as spaces of settlement. I put Newfoundland there. I also put New Zealand. These are jurisdictions that started off as bases to offload populations sometimes not necessarily very agreeable populations. Think of Tasmania, for example, which started off as a penal colony, right? Australia started off as a penal colony. And eventually, of course, the place has been rehabilitated. It's okay, Pat. It's all right. The fourth type of island is the fief. Haiti, Sicily, PEI, question mark. Notice that all the Canadian examples have a question mark because this is my proposal to you, whether they make sense or not, right? I've only been a citizen of Canada for how many hours now? Almost 23 hours. So I'm not going to tell you what I think about Canada. You have to tell me. The fief is the locale which basically thrives on its ability to siphon off resources from a dependent position from somewhere else, right? So there's somebody somewhere who basically allows that space to develop ex gratia, out of benevolence, paternalist, benign benevolence. Right? Prince Edward Island gets 40% of its budget out of Ottawa, for example. It's probably the highest in the Atlantic region, percentage-wise. The way in which these resources are transferred also allows a local elite to maintain local control, including the distribution of those resources. So the political system, even though notionally a democracy, operates very much like a spoil system, right? You make sure you belong to the party in government to enjoy the benefits of its rule. Otherwise, you're out in the cold until, of course, the wind changes direction. I think euphemisms are suitable in this context. The fortress economy, again, a different type of economy which is regarded and held highly because of its geostrategic location. So that's why people would be interested in places like Cyprus and Malta. Historically, they happen to be in strategic places. Whoever controls Malta controls the Mediterranean. Whoever controls the Suez Canal controls, the Red Sea. Singapore, again, very similar location. So that explains that. The sixth model is the refuge, where basically you have an enclave situation. You have a locale that is trying to protect itself from being engulfed by a larger power in the region, whoever that may be. And finally, the seventh one, and I put a tick there because I consider this in a way to be the most successful from a governance perspective, the most successful type of island environment, the Anthropo. The Anthropo island, Hong Kong, Manhattan, Singapore, there are other examples out there. These are spaces that manage to very much, they have determined an economic trajectory of development that's locally specific, first of all. It's locally driven, secondly, and also managing to attract resources from elsewhere. So they act as huge magnets of talent, of capital, of resources, of merchandise, and what have you, including a multi-diversity of the people who live on those places, right? So these are high-density, metropolitan, cosmopolitan spaces that, in a way, usurp the traditional definition of an island. They are certainly not isolated. If anything, they're not isolated. They're absolutely plugged in. One interesting piece of research that I did a few years ago had to do with the impact of bridges on islands.